and the interreligious crisis of whether people of different religions can live together in peaceful coexistence. The interreligious crisis involves virtually all the religions, but it is focused mainly on the relations between Christians and Muslims, who constitute, respectively, the world's two most populous religions, with Christians currently numbering 2.1 billion and Muslims numbering 1.6 billion. The Daily News testifies to the intensity of the crisis between Islam and the West, an intensity that over the past several years has taken on an increasingly explicit religious tone. So we are encountering headwinds, and we are buffeted frequently by violent puffs, such as the massacre in San Bernardino on December 2nd, and the mass attacks in Paris on November 13th. Yet, it is well to bear in mind that headwinds can be good for steerage. As a perennial novice in sailing, under the expert guidance of my wife, Jane, who grew up on the water, I have found over the years that when I'm headed upwind, it feels easier to steer a straight course toward where the next tack will begin. Similarly, we can use the religious headwinds we're encountering to clarify our view of the world, keep us alert to shifting developments, and ready our wills to engage fruitfully with the opportunities that this crisis presents. In steering a straight course, I suggest several course corrections at the outset in the headwinds that we're experiencing. The course corrections I suggest all come under this rubric. Think religiously about the interreligious crisis. Think religiously about the interreligious crisis. Don't think only politically. Don't think only sociologically. Don't think only demographically. Yes, the global interreligious crisis has many ramifications, and we need to keep those ramifications in mind. As religious people, though, we must keep the religious dimension in central focus. Now, this exhortation to you has several strands. First, focus on religion amid the flood of politics. Keep attuned to the religious dimension amid all the current political debate raging about the relationship of Islam to Christianity and the West. Recent U.S. debates involve a call to stop further Muslim immigration, calls to explicitly name Islamic terrorism and discard more generic characterizations, calls to bomb ISIS strongholds back to the 7th century, a reference to the period of Islam's emergence, and then objections to an Arabic calligraphy lesson in Virginia being focused on the Shahada, which is the universal Muslim faith declaration, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. In Europe, the initial embrace of more than 1 million mostly Muslim refugees has turned into controversy about the New Year's Eve attacks on European women in Cologne and elsewhere, confrontations between pro- and anti-immigration demonstrators, and soul-searching about how many Muslim immigrants can be assimilated into a reasonably stable European identity. These debates are political. Now, in saying that, I am not disparaging the debates, for politics is about power, the important matter of using and distributing power to get work done. Practically every human interaction, even between any two people in this room, has a political dimension because practically every human interaction involves the use and allocation of power to accomplish goals. So politics is important and inescapable, and it is certainly not bad. Political debates about the relationship of Islam to Christianity in the West involve perceptions of power and the allocation of power, all in order to accomplish the important work of building a society that flourishes with justice and prosperity. Many Europeans and North Americans see how power is allocated in many Muslim societies, and they do not want to see a shift in that direction in their own societies. People are understandably anxious about the treatment of women and religious minorities, and about the overall choice between democracy and the options of oligarchy, dictatorship, and theocracy. As citizens, we are rightly concerned about these political issues of power. As Christian citizens, though, we cannot confine our concerns to the political. We are religiously committed. Christianity is intrinsic to our identity. We must consider the crisis from a religious standpoint, pray about the crisis from a religious standpoint, and act in the crisis from a religious standpoint. This can mean many things related to exploring Islam and developing relationships with Muslims, which I'll address later. But the first correction is this: focus on the religious as well as the political. The second course correction is this: recognize the reality of religious motivation. I say this in order to counter a denial reflex that commonly kicks in for many people when violence related to religion occurs. I just heard it in a conversation last night. The denial reflex is clear on a placard carried at a recent demonstration in New York. Quote, "Terrorism has no religion," unquote. That placard expressed a wish, but it does not fit the facts. Terrorism often does have a religion. It may be Islam, as in the San Bernardino and Paris mass killings and the atrocities of ISIS. It may be Christianity, as in the Colorado Springs killing and church-sanctioned lynchings of African Americans in American history. It may be Judaism, as in killings by settlers on the West Bank. It may be Hinduism, as in the Gujarat riots of 2002, when 1,000 Muslims were killed. It may be Sikhism, as in the violent insurgency in Indian Punjab in the 1980s. It may even be Buddhism, as religious minorities in Myanmar and Sri Lanka now know. So is religion inherently pernicious? No. For not only are most people in the world religious, but the religious practice of most people grounds them spiritually and nurtures wisdom, compassion, and communal commitment. The denial reflex insists that those who kill in the name of religion are not, in fact, Muslims or Christians or Hindus or whatever, but just claiming to be such. Because, so the arguments go, Islam is a religion of peace, or Jesus taught not violence, or Hinduism would never condone killing, and so on. This response is well-meaning. It is an attempt to shield faithful religionists from a horrified but misinformed public, equating this or that religion, most acutely Islam at the moment, with the violence perpetrated by some of its adherents. But asserting that violent killers are not members of the religion they profess does not fit facts. Robert Deere, who shot up a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs on November 27th, had idiosyncratic views of Christianity that were probably affected by mental illness. But his statements indicate that he was in the orbit of Christian fundamentalism. Not only were the San Bernardino killers apparently inspired by ISIS, but Saeed Farouk attended mosque regularly, and his wife Tashfeen Malik was known to be devout. Denying that religious killers are genuinely religious not only denies facts, perhaps even more important, it forecloses the one most promising means of countering such extremism. And that is for religious communities to take responsibility for their fundamentalists, their extremists, and their militants, and try to transform the context in which such fundamentalist militancy takes root. For if the attackers in Paris or San Bernardino were not Muslims, if their attacks had nothing to do with Islam, it means that U.S. American and French Muslim communities are absolved from trying to address the root causes of the extremism being embraced by many of their young people. And if mosques and Muslim schools are going to do nothing about preventing extremism taking hold, then who else has any hope of preventing such extremism from metastasizing in Muslim communities? That is definitely a recipe for a clash of civilizations, with levels of hatred, hostility, and violence that are dreadful to contemplate. But let's broaden the discussion beyond Islam. If the settlers attacking Palestinians in Israel's occupied territories are not Jews, that means that Israeli Jewish communities have no responsibility for trying to convince them to take a more moderate stance. In fact, it is other Jews, not any non-Jews, who have the best chance of persuading them otherwise. If the Hindu nationalists attacking religious minorities in India are not real Hindus, that means that Hindu communities in India have no responsibility for trying to convince them to take a more moderate stance. In fact, it is other Hindus, not any non-Hindus, who have the best chance of persuading them otherwise. Let's look at Christian instances. Jim Jones, the pastor who famously induced close to 1,000 followers to drink the poisoned Kool-Aid at Jonestown in Guyana in 1979, did not start out as a paranoid pro-communist politico, but as a standard-issue United Methodist minister with a social action outreach. The Branch Davidians at Waco, Texas, were like many Christians worldwide in taking lots of marching orders from the Old Testament. So their Christianity was different from that of the Christianity of most of the people in this room, or at least I hope. But they identified themselves as Christians, and that needs to be taken at face value. If we Christians say simply that these people and various other groups like them are not Christians, we are absolving ourselves from responsibility to prevent fundamentalism, extremism, and militancy in our own religious ranks. If we have no responsibility, then who does have responsibility? If we in the religions wash our hands of our militants, the future holds only more bloodshed, not the hoped-for day of tolerance and peace. Now let me address two little words, real and true. Those two adjectives are obfuscating words that are often used in these discussions. The Paris attackers, it is said, were not real Muslims. David Koresh was not a real Christian. Hindu nationalists are not real Hindus. Violent Israeli settlers are not real Jews. In using such adjectives, mainstream religionists are making theological assessments. But such theological assessments should not obscure the reality that all the marginal groups in question self-identify as Hindu, Jew, Christian, or Muslim, and have a legitimate claim to be considered so. Besides, we have our own sad history of Roman Catholics seeing Protestants and Anglicans as not real or true Christians, and vice versa. And our own history of Anglicans viewing Puritans and nonconformists as not real or true Christians, and the contemporary reality of schismatic Anglicans in the United States seeing mainstream Anglicans as not being real or true Anglicans or real or true Christians. This history should make us suspicious of the adjectives real and true in discussions of terrorism. Denying someone their religious identity should not be our response to substantial disagreement with them. What we Christians should be saying about our extremists is, yes, they are Christians, but they are misguided and mistaken Christians, and we must address the reasons why they are adopting these views and undertaking these destructive actions. Similarly, what Muslims should be saying about their extremists is, yes, they are Muslims, but they are misguided and mistaken Muslims, and we must address the reasons why they are adopting these views and undertaking these destructive actions. A common trope amid these events is this: our religion does not condone violence and atrocity. No religion condones such acts. The fact is that every religion has elements in its scriptures and traditions that twisted minds can and will twist to justify violence and atrocity. In particular, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scriptures have elements that can be taken as exhortations to violence. Even from Jesus, we have those enigmatic words, "I came to bring not peace, but a sword." Now, over the past several centuries, we've developed a tradition of critical scholarship that contextualizes such statements, both in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian scriptures. That process is beginning in Islam, but only just beginning. So the second course correction is this: recognize the reality of religious motivation. A third course correction is this: recognize the power of religion in society. On a global basis, discussion of religious conflict is sometimes critiqued as misrepresenting complex social phenomena as religious. Such conflicts, it is often said, are really political, economic, ethnic in motivation and aim. And religion is simply being used as a pretext for such ends. I'm sure you've heard this. You may have even thought this. Here are several responses. First, all social phenomena are complex and must be analyzed case by case. A particular conflict may have political, economic, and ethnic dimensions, but that does not exclude religion as a factor in the analysis, whether the instances are ancient, medieval, or modern. Second, the tendency to discount the power of religion in society today reflects 20th century Euro-American academic and cultural assumptions about the marginalization of religion amid the supposed inevitability of secularization. In the mid-20th century, people in the West thought that the four challenges of Darwinian evolution, Marxist communism, Freudian psychology, and market capitalism would make religion irrelevant. But that has turned out to be only yet another Western ethnocentric projection onto the rest of the world. In fact, the 21st century is indelibly religious, shockingly religious, and in the West as well as the rest. This development has been especially shocking for Western European societies that thought that they had outgrown religion. Third, virtually all social conflicts concern distribution of power among groups and are thus inherently political. It is just as possible for power to be contested between groups that are defined by religious affiliation as it is for groups defined by economic or ethnic interest. When people fight, they are fighting for power for their group. And the religious identity of their group may be just as important to them as its ethnic, linguistic, national, or economic identity, or even more important. In short, religion is an independent variable in social dynamics, just as independent as ethnicity, economics, and politics. So the third course correction is recognize the power of religion in society. Now, what I have termed course corrections do not chart a future. Instead, they are only navigational aids, so that whatever future we chart is guided by a compass that is steady and accurate, not steering off course. Again, the overall guideline: think religiously about interreligious crisis. Then first, focus on religion amid the flood of politics. Then recognize the reality of religious motivation. And third, recognize the power of religion in society. So, how do we move forward in Christian-Muslim engagement in the 21st century? How should we as Christians seek to engage with Muslims to glorify God and build a flourishing and fruitful world community in the 21st century? First, we must go out of our way. We must go out of our way. You're familiar with the phrase, like ships passing in the night. Well, suppose one of those ships at dawn realizes it needs to rendezvous with the other ship. To do so, it must go out of its way. That means at least altering course to meet the other ship's course. It might even mean a full course reverse, and then full speed ahead to overtake the other. On a more personal level, we've all had rows with someone else when one or both parties storms off in a huff. To catch that person, you have to run after that person. Go out of your way to resume the conversation or the shouting match or the makeup session or whatever. You have to go out of your way. Now, the background I bring to this is partly inheritance, partly initiative. Not only did I grow up in India, but I grew up with parents, Henry and Marion, who in addition to being missionaries were religious researchers. My father is a sociologist, my mother is a psychologist of religion, both of them teaching at a theological college in central India. So not only did I grow up among Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Parsis, but in a family where systematic research trips out to visit with people at temples and mosques were part of the fabric of our family life. Having grown up in Fargo, North Dakota, in the teens and 20s of the last century, my parents went out of their way to encounter people on paths very different from their own. So that's my inheritance. The initiative side of it is twofold in my own mission journey. In the 1980s, my wife, Jane, who is halfway back in here in the audience, my wife, Jane, and I, with our 4 young children, young at the time, were missionaries of the Episcopal Church in Zimbabwe shortly after the inauguration of black majority rule in that country. Christianity among the Shona people of Zimbabwe was so different that it felt almost like an interreligious encounter. And our own lives in prayer, worship, preaching, and community were permanently affected. But of course, we were among Christians. What arose for me in this decade of the 2010s was the opportunity to engage at close quarters with Islam as principal of Edwards College in Peshawar, Pakistan. As the capital of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the province where the Taliban are insurgent against the Pakistani state, Peshawar is well known as a dangerous location. Many of the dreadful news stories from Pakistan, including last week's bombing of a police post and the attack on Bacha Khan University in Charsadda, and I've been there, are datelined from Peshawar. So why did I go to Peshawar? Well, a number of factors combined to impart a sense of calling. Jane and I had been in relationship with church leaders in Peshawar for well over 10 years, mainly with Mano Rumal Shah and the person who succeeded him as bishop in the Diocese of Peshawar of the Church of Pakistan, Humphrey Sarfaraz Peters. And we had visited there. So there was a long-standing connection. Then globally, it had become clear to me, especially since 9/11, that engagement with the world of Islam is one of the major challenges facing Christians in the 21st century. Given the ramifications of what Samuel Huntington famously called the clash of civilizations, mainline churches have tended to steer clear of the Muslim heartlands and wring our hands. Here was an opportunity to engage. The demographic center of Islam is not the Arab world, but Asia. Further, I felt intuitively that there was something more for me to learn about God in community with Muslims. If opportunity beckoned in an Islamist enclave such as Peshawar, so be it. Education is an important avenue of countering extremism. The oldest institution of higher education in the border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan, Edwards, get this, is a church college with a majority Muslim constituency. A church college with a majority Muslim constituency. 90% of the faculty and students are Muslims, 7% are Christians, and 2% are Hindus and Sikhs. This presented a remarkable opportunity to nurture open discourse and interfaith understanding in one of the most polarized regions of the world. Finally, there was the mandate to stand in solidarity with Christian communities who suffer in the tension between Muslims and Christians. Pakistan was established as a haven for South Asia's Muslims who feared being a minority in a majority Hindu India. Yet despite having an overwhelming 96% majority in their own country, many Pakistani Muslims maintain a fearful minority mentality that prompts them to persecute their nation's religious minorities, especially Christians and Hindus. Most of Pakistan's Christians are confined to menial labor with little opportunity for advancement, and there are sporadic outbreaks of violence against Christians. So standing with an oppressed Christian community was a factor in my going to Peshawar. My point is this: I went out of my way. Obviously, that was a somewhat extreme instance of going out of one's way. And I'm not urging people here tonight to go to Cairo or Amman or Damascus or Mosul in order to encounter Muslims. But do be willing to go out of your way. You might attend a class on Islam. Better yet, you might attend a liturgy at any one of the 3 mosques in Jacksonville or the mosque in St. Augustine. Maybe Friday prayers or some other gathering. You might feel strange, nervous, worried about whether you'd be welcomed, unsure of how to comport yourself in that setting. I can assure you that you would be welcome. Just ask for help about anything that worries you. What would be the point of this? Not to be a voyeur. The point would be to shift your perspective from considering Islam as an it, an objectified reality out there to talk about and worry about, to experiencing Islam as a you. The shift would be from wondering about your relationship with Islam as a religion to initiating a relationship with actual Muslims. And that's my next suggestion. Initiate relationship with Muslims. Hello, my name is Emily. Oh, hello, I'm Sana. Or, hi, I'm Gary. Oh, my name is Ashraf. Are you a Muslim? No, I'm a Christian. But I've never visited a mosque before, and I thought I'd like to meet Muslims in my community. Or it could be that there are Muslims closer at hand, a few houses down on your street, or a couple of desks over at your office. Hi, I'm Linda. I don't believe we've met. Good to meet you. My name is Aksa. Great, Aksa. So glad to meet you finally. Would you like to do lunch sometime? And so on. And then it could be that your visit to a mosque, to a worship event, would actually come out of that relationship, and you'd have someone accompanying you to mosque. Especially in the headwinds created by negative and hateful rhetoric on both sides, we as disciples of Jesus must sail out of our way to develop relationships with Muslims. Personal relationships are not an automatic solvent for Muslim-Christian conflict, but it is difficult to even approach addressing the conflict without some personal relationship. Indeed, when we speak of interreligious relations, we must have in mind relations between religious people, not relations between the theoretical constructions of religion. So in Christian-Muslim relations, we must focus on relations between Christians and Muslims, individuals, people, live human beings. Christianity and Islam exist not in the abstract, but in the faith and practice of actual Christians and actual Muslims. And so it is with Muslims that we must engage, not with Islam. So first, go out of your way. Second, initiate relationship. Third, develop friendship. Now, we all have different kinds of friendships, and no one can tell anyone else how to develop a friendship, but we all know what friendship is, and we all know how we ourselves develop friendships. So however you do it, be open and take steps toward developing friendship with a Muslim or with several Muslims. Now, as you might imagine, I have many friends in Peshawar, and in my exile from that place, I miss them. It's a deep sadness. With my Christian friends there is the delight of affection in shared faith in a minority situation that is always fraught with sensitivity and sometimes danger. With my Muslim friends, there's a different kind of delight, the delight of affection developed over the boundary of religious difference, especially in an environment where religious difference can and so often does issue in violence and death. I think of Khalid Nasser, a boisterous, gregarious, and politically astute fellow well met, with whom I worked closely, who jokes about what a bad Muslim he is, who wept openly the morning after Malala Yousafzai was shot in the head by the Taliban in the Swat Valley. I think of Muhammad Ali, a Shia Muslim who was so solicitous for my welfare that it seemed excessive, until adverse events proved that he had good reason to be so concerned for me, and I recognized his concern as real love and not simply fussing. Muhammad Khan, hard-bitten and judicious, always open to humor, the father of 5 children, the person who accompanied me to Friday prayers at the local mosque across the road that was so small that 80% of the worshipers, including ourselves, had to line up in rows on the street outside. I could go on, but I won't. We read in 1 Peter, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Love and friendship, I suggest, gives relationship the tensile strength to cover a multitude of differences, including deep religious differences. As you might imagine, interreligious groups are not common in Pakistan, so it's important to cherish them wherever they crop up. The one interfaith group in Peshawar, which, by the way, is a metropolitan area of about 3 to 5 million people, big place. The one interfaith group there is called Faith Friends. Faith Friends. Not the Peshawar Interreligious Dialogue Group, but Faith Friends. I always liked that name. It signifies no agenda except to develop friendship over differences in faith. A name that signifies that interreligious friendship is a sufficient end in itself. A name that need raise no anxieties about tangled discussions or covert proselytism. A name that communicates the possibility of friendship in religious faith, even though the faith may be expressed differently. Meetings were meals organized around the various Muslim, Christian, Hindu, and Sikh festival days, typically the Muslim Eid, the Christian Christmas or Easter, the Hindu Diwali, and so forth. Fourth, explore, discuss, discover. Part of what I mean, of course, is talk. Undertake dialogue. Ordinary conversation will encompass a great deal: family, recreation, books, current events. Those are the warp and woof of a relationship tapestry. And as that becomes denser, it will have the strength to bear conversation about faith and religion. I emphasize the importance of talking about faith and religion in the current crisis. As I said at the outset, think religiously about the interreligious crisis. And that means in part being willing to discuss your faith and learn about the faith of another. Now, this may make you nervous. Talking about religion, You don't want to be mistaken for being either an exhibitionist or a proselytizer. Since religious difference has recently been leading to violence, you don't want remotely to be the occasion of ill feeling or hostility. Now, the situation in Peshawar was certainly an environment of violence prompted by religion. The vast majority of my daily interactions were with Muslims, so I was constantly aware of the need to express myself in ways that would avoid offense of any kind. Nevertheless, even in that environment, I welcomed religious conversation initiated by others, and I sometimes initiated religious conversation myself. I did so eagerly, for I'm a naturally curious person, and as I said earlier, I was in Pakistan partly to learn something more about God in the company of Muslims. Here are a couple of examples. On one occasion, I asked a physics lecturer what his particular interests were in physics. Parallel universes and the wormholes between them, he replied. I find those possibilities fascinating. As we talked, I ventured that the concept of heaven, which both Islam and Christianity share, is theologically similar to the notion of parallel universes, and that the concept of resurrection could be a theological corollary to wormholes. We launched into a theological discussion of these themes from Muslim and Christian perspectives. When I asked whether he had discussed his work with the leader of any mosque, he said that imams and mullahs in Peshawar would frown on his work, so he would not be inclined to discuss it with them. Well, I, as a Christian mullah, felt honored that we were having the discussion and gratified that he could have a theological discussion with me that he could not have with his own religious leaders. Now, here's an example of pursuing a topic as far as we could go and then seeing that it would be unwise to pursue it further. Some faculty members and I were just chatting in the garden outside our meeting room while awaiting some late arrivals. This was an evening meeting, and everyone was dressed in shalwar kameez and very relaxed, just chatting. Talk initially focused on one of our members who had recently returned from Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim is obligated to make at least once during his or her lifetime. After we heard about his experience, how it had gone, I remarked that on any one of the number of TV stations in Pakistan that do nothing except 24 hours a day televise the procession around the Kaaba in Mecca. So I noted that in looking at that procession, I had noticed that men and women were processing together. And I noted in this conversation that men and women are strictly kept apart in all the mosques of Pakistan and in most mosques around the world. When I asked why there is such a difference between Mecca and the ordinary mosque in Peshawar, it was clear not only that no one had an answer, but that no one considered it wise to speculate on the reasons for that difference. Well, I'm a speculator. So I continued the conversation by noting that the vestments and singing processions in Christian worship tradition arose out of an anticipation of what heaven might be like. You think about all those processions in the Revelation to St. John the Divine and how our processions at Christ Church Ponte Vedra or anywhere else anticipate that heavenly procession. An analogy with that, I wondered aloud whether the mixed procession around the Kaaba might enact a Muslim vision of gender equality in heaven, an eschatological anticipation of how things might be at the consummation of all things. Well, that was a conversation stopper. And I knew better than to pursue the matter further. What I was encountering was the strict limit Peshawar Muslims felt about theological inquiry and speculation. Now, many in Peshawar were reluctant to talk about religion at all because of its sensitivity. I was careful, but overall my view was that the sensitivity of religion made it all the more important to talk about. In a situation of religious polarization where Muslims misunderstood Christians and Christians misunderstood Muslims, I felt it especially important to open channels of spiritual and theological discussion. Such discussion, I believed, was crucial to overcoming the sense of the two religions being two great dark unknowns to each other. Each conversation could be a point of light, an extension of understanding, a small stone in building up a foundation of mutual trust. My point is this: if that's possible in Peshawar, and it was, it's certainly possible in Ponte Vedra and in Greater Jacksonville. So first, go out of your way. Second, initiate relationship. Third, develop friendship. Fourth, explore, discuss, and discover. Now, here are 4 further observations about interreligious conversations and conversations between Christians and Muslims. First, think about your theology of religions. Theology of religions is a term for your thinking about the status of all religions and the status of your own religion in relation to other religions. Here's a fourfold typology that's been suggested by the Roman Catholic scholar Paul Nitter. He suggests four models. The first is the replacement model, in which one religion is advocated as replacing all others. Then there's the fulfillment model, in which all religions find their fulfillment in one religion. Then the mutuality model, in which all religions are valid and are called to be in dialogue. And then what I call the incommensurability model, in which religions are seen as so different from each other that they cannot even be compared, let alone reconciled. It's helpful to situate your own thinking among those options. I'm not here tonight to advocate one of those models, but it's helpful for you if you think about where your own theology of religions is. Second, be prepared for your theology of religions to shift from time to time. If you're like me, you tend toward one or another of the theology of religion models most of the time. But you may be like me in another way. For I find myself drawn toward different models at different times, in different settings, in different conversations, as I find myself responding to different people and events, hearing new insights, learning things I didn't know before. I think of E. Stanley Jones, the great Methodist evangelist in India, who served from about 1920 to about 1970. Early in his work, he arranged any number of what he called roundtable conferences, to which he would invite Hindus and Muslims and Jains and Sikhs and Parsis and Christians to talk about the merits and claims of their religions. Now, E. Stanley Jones was a remarkable giant in Christian faith. And yet he said he went into each one of those roundtable conferences with his heart in his throat because he felt he needed to be converted if someone else's religious claim seemed to point in that direction for him. In the end, he never did. But that willingness to be so open in religious conversation, I think, is important and edifying. Third, explore differences as well as commonalities. One of the most tired cliches of interreligious encounter is, well, you know, all religions are really the same, and we're all worshiping the same God. Well, actually, we may or may not be worshiping the same God. That's an issue for you to sort out in your theology of religions. But whether or not we're worshiping the same God, the religions have important differences as well as commonalities, and don't be afraid of those. Pretending otherwise keeps our mutual engagement superficial. Going deep in interreligious encounter means discovering and exploring differences as well as discovering and exploring commonalities and the various shades in between. One aspect of Muslim practice, for instance, that has influenced my own quite decisively is raising one's open hands in prayer, which helps me to cultivate an inner openness to God's presence. This is in contrast to all the various other things that we Christians do with our hands as we pray. You won't see any of that among Muslims. They stand or sit with their hands open. And I do that quite consistently now, whether I'm in private or in public or in a small group or large group. Similarly, the Muslims' 5 daily times for prayer always remind me of the importance of not only regular prayer, but frequent prayer. Of course, this was especially vivid in Peshawar, where the mosques issue the azan, the call to prayer via loudspeakers from the minarets. The first one well before dawn in the darkness, and the last one well into the night in the darkness. Now, Roman Catholics and Anglicans have liturgical resources for at least 4 daily offices: morning prayer, noonday prayer, evening prayer, and compline. But how many of us use those offices with any regularity? Those are differences from which I've learned. And then there are differences that I continue to ponder, and sometimes they trouble me. One Muslim challenged Jesus' teaching about forgiveness and loving one's enemies because to him it seemed to compromise the imperative of justice. Christians and Muslims both believe in a judgment at the end of time, but I was surprised by how prominent the judgment theme was in the thought of one Muslim conversationalist. Muslims believe that both Jesus and Muhammad were simply men, whereas Christians believe that Jesus' nature was divine as well as human. Yet Christians feel free to speculate easily about the life of Jesus. That's what makes a Bible study interesting and stimulating. Whereas fears of blasphemy function as a hedge around conversation about Muhammad, as well as conversation about the Quran. So there are real differences. Fourth, in the life of religious communities around Jacksonville, such as Christ Church, Ponte Vedra, you might consider something called scriptural reasoning as a possibility for organizing intentional interreligious conversation with Muslims, Jews, and others. Scriptural reasoning is an international movement, and its model is appealingly simple. Dialogue begins not with discussions of an abstract topic, where the need for expertise can be intimidating, nor does it begin with discussion of personal faith experience, where the need for vulnerability can be equally intimidating. Instead, it begins with what is foundational and just objectively out there in all of the religions, and that is our scriptures. So, if Jewish, Muslim, and Christian believers get together on a regular basis, the way it might go is a theme would be chosen, and at a particular meeting, the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim members choose a short passage from their scriptures around that theme, read it out, give a short explanation about its background, and then invite discussion. And then so it goes, group by group, around the small meeting. The goal is not agreement, certainly not argument, but rather growth in understanding one another's traditions through exploring the texts and their possible interpretations. I am not much versed in the Quran, but discovering it has been edifying. I was startled, for instance, to find that the Quran has more about Mary than the Bible does. An especially endearing vignette has Mary giving birth to Jesus under a palm tree, where a voice told her that if she shook the trunk, ripe dates would fall into her lap. We use that at Christmas at Edwards College alongside Luke's nativity account. And then there are appealing passages of spirituality like this one. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. His light may be compared to a niche that enshrines a lamp, the lamp within a crystal of star-like brilliance. It is lit from a blessed olive tree, neither eastern nor western. We can read a lot into that, huh? Its very oil would almost shine forth, though no fire touched it. Light upon light, God guides to his light whom he will. Fifth or sixth, I can't remember my numbering, act together as well as talk together. So far I've emphasized talk, simply because talk is what people tend most to avoid. But undertaking joint projects of social outreach can be helpful in building relationships and friendship. As a church and a mosque reach out together to save the hungry and homeless, they can find friendships developing that become the foundation for further work together and for the kind of conversation I've been advocating. And finally, bear witness to the fruit of your interreligious journey. Your journey of Christians and Muslims together might be a very personal and individual journey, or it might be a group undertaking. Either way, talk with others about how it's going, the gifts you've given and the gifts you've received, the challenges you've encountered, the breakthroughs you've made. In today's environment, the more people hear about Christians and Muslims talking and working together, the more encouraged they will be to initiate talk and action themselves. So first, go out of your way. Second, initiate relationship. Third, develop friendship. Fourth, explore, discuss, discover. And in your conversation, think about your theology of religions. Be prepared to shift in your theology of religions. Explore differences as well as commonalities. Consider a conversational framework, such as scriptural reasoning. Act together as well as talk together. And bear witness to the fruit of your interreligious journey. Now, in this talk, I've borne witness to some of my own interreligious journey, and now I must bear witness to another chapter of it. A major initiative of Edwards College in the Diocese of Peshawar during my time there was the effort to secure degree awarding status for the college so that we could design our own curriculum and be freed from the outdated syllabi of the University of Peshawar, through which we awarded our degrees. The ways we were improving our educational offerings and the additional programs we were instituting, such as the Integrity Project for building character and an English immersion project, prompted the provincial government to encourage our degree awarding status with the unprecedented gift of over $3 million to secure more doctorates, enhance the library, improve the labs, and build a new academic block. But we also needed a government charter, a government-approved charter. And for that, the church and the college collaborated in restoring the church to the full oversight role it had had before the government had eroded it over several decades. And this was an exercise in religious freedom. For the Constitution of Pakistan guarantees to individuals the right to profess, practice, and propagate their religion, and to all religious groups that they have the absolute right to manage their own institutions. So, the proposed charter restored a church majority to the board and proposed that the bishop be the chancellor. There was pushback from the provincial government and from Muslim faculty who had long wanted to take control of the college. This was a religious conflict, a church-state conflict over whether the Christian minority in a majority Muslim country could retain control of its flagship institution and exercise its religious freedom as promised by the Constitution of Pakistan. When it became clear that the church was not going to compromise on its rightful oversight, the opponents resorted to threats, intimidation, and violence, and this culminated in a physical attack on myself by agents of the military's all-powerful inter-services intelligence, during which they threatened to kill me if I didn't leave the country. And that is why I am in exile from that work now. That experience has had a number of important dimensions for me. Being physically beaten deepened my solidarity with the suffering Christians of Pakistan, who for decades have been suffering discrimination, oppression, and violence at the hand of the Muslim majority. Violence much worse than I experienced. It deepened my relationship with Christ, whose suffering was and continues to be in solidarity with the pain and anguish of the entire human family throughout history. It drew me into a place of prayer, where I realized I was called not only to pray for my enemies, but to pray with my enemies. In that place, I cannot demonize them as one-dimensional caricatures, but must acknowledge their full humanity, their family life, their professional life, their prayer life, their spiritual life. In all of this, I've been able to enter into a place where I can forgive those who instigated an attack, not only on me, but through me on the entire Christian community of Pakistan. After a presentation about our work partway through my time in Pakistan, a British academic asked me, "Are you optimistic about your work and about Pakistan?" I said, "No. It is hard to be optimistic about education or interfaith relations or religious freedom in Pakistan. But I am a person of faith. As a person of faith, I may not be optimistic, but I am infinitely hopeful because my faith is in God. And in God, all things are possible, if not now, then sometime in God's own future. And I say the same today. So there are setbacks, and there will continue to be setbacks. Christians and Muslims are people of faith, faith in God. As such, we must nourish the hope to which God continually gives birth. I do believe Christians bring particular gifts to such a community of shared hope. Confidence arising from the revelation that God so identifies with humanity that God became incarnate among us. the embrace of sacrificial suffering, the moving of the Holy Spirit. Muslims also bring particular gifts, such as the discipline of prayer and a stress on righteous living. Dear friends, this night, we can live together. We can learn together. We can transform the world together. We must live together. We must learn together. We must transform the world together. May God give us the strength and the vision and the perseverance to carry out that call. Thank you for your attention.